You have exactly 30 days to get your junk out of here, Mr. Reynolds barked, his voice echoing across the cracked sidewalk. I looked up from the box of old dishes I was sorting, the summer heat sticking my shirt to my back. All around me, neighbors pretended not to listen, but I could feel their eyes on my little apartment. The same building I'd been scrubbing and painting for years, the same porch where my mom used to sit on warm evenings, dreaming of something better. Reynolds flicked a glossy eviction notice at my feet. People like you never last in neighborhoods like this. My hands trembled just enough to betray the storm inside me, but I didn't say a word. Instead, I picked up the paper and pressed it flat against my chest, feeling something harden deep in my gut. I was 29 when that notice landed on my porch, but sometimes I still felt like the broke kid people had laughed at in the school cafeteria. My name is Tyler James, born in a creaky duplex on the edge of Oak Ridge Avenue. Back then, this neighborhood wasn't the shiny grid of yoga studios and wine bars it's trying to become now. It was rows of sagging porches, kids on rusted bikes, and the smell of fried chicken drifting out of Mrs. Carter's kitchen every Sunday. My mother, Deborah James, worked nights cleaning offices downtown. She'd come home before dawn, shoes in her hand so she wouldn't wake me, and sometimes I'd watch her through the cracked bedroom door, the way she'd count every tip and coupon like it might disappear if she blinked. When she finally sat down, she'd close her eyes and whisper a promise I still hear when the night's too quiet. One day, we'll own something nobody can take. That idea was a tiny seed that dug its roots into me, even when I didn't realize it. Growing up, I learned to stay invisible. Kids with names like Chase and Olivia made sure I knew I wasn't welcome in their circle. My shoes were knockoffs, my backpack secondhand. I still remember one afternoon when I was 12, standing outside Parker's Market while my mom scraped change for a gallon of milk. Chase's father, Mr. Gallagher, stepped out of a glossy black SUV. He looked at me like I was something stuck to the bottom of his shoe. "Deborah, you really ought to consider moving somewhere more appropriate," he said. "This area is going to turn soon, and it's not going to be cheap." My mom just nodded, her smile tight, like she'd stitched it there to keep from breaking. Later that night, I asked her why she didn't say something back. She just sighed and ran her hand over my hair. "Pride doesn't pay rent, baby, but patience might." By high school, I was mowing lawns to help with groceries. I'd take the bus to the fancy side of town, where the lawns were perfect and the houses looked like magazine spreads. I'd haul my mower up and down those manicured yards, pretending the smell of cut grass didn't remind me of everything we didn't have. Once, Mrs. Larson, a woman who paid me to trim her hedges every other Saturday, brought out a cold lemonade. She watched me drink it like she was doing charity work. "You know," she said, "some people just aren't meant for more." That's not an insult, Tyler. It's just the way life is. I remember the sweetness of the lemonade turning sour in my mouth. I set the glass down carefully, thanked her, and kept working. But something shifted inside me that day. I stopped thinking about getting out. I started thinking about owning it all. After graduation, college was out of reach. We barely had enough for rent, much less tuition. I took a job in construction, working 12-hour shifts hauling sheetrock and scraping drywall dust off my arms at night. But even when my body was exhausted, my mind never stopped. I read everything I could find, library books about real estate, old manuals on property management, and hand-me-down magazines about flipping houses. My foreman, a gruff man named Stan Whitaker, noticed. One evening, when everyone else had clocked out, he caught me stuffing a dog-eared paperback about real estate into my backpack. "You planning to be my boss someday, kid?" he asked. I looked him square in the eye. "Yeah, someday." He let out a booming laugh, but he didn't mock me the way I expected. He just clapped me on the shoulder. "Then don't waste your time dreaming. Learn everything you can, and save every damn penny." So that's what I did. Over the next few years, I scraped together every dollar I could. I lived in the same cramped apartment I'd grown up in. I drove a rusted Ford Ranger that rattled like it might collapse if I turned too hard. But by 26, I'd saved enough for a tiny down payment on a neglected duplex a few streets over. It was the first property I ever owned, and it was a wreck, Leaking pipes, rotting floors, a front porch that sagged so low I had to prop it up with cinder blocks. But when I held that deed in my hand, I felt something crack open in my chest. That night, I sat cross-legged on the bare living room floor, the air thick with mildew, and I called my mom. She was tired, her voice soft from her evening shift. "I did it," I whispered. "I bought it." There was silence on the other end. Then, finally, she spoke. "I knew you would, baby. I always knew." From there, it was one property at a time. I learned how to patch drywall, snake plumbing, and negotiate contracts with men who thought I was too young, too broke, too desperate to stand my ground. Some nights, I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering if I was out of my mind. The bank loans were suffocating, the repairs endless. But I remembered Mrs. Larson's words, "Some people just aren't meant for more," and every time they echoed in my head, I felt a surge of determination that no amount of fatigue could kill. 3 years into it, I'd managed to buy 2 more buildings, old rentals with tenants who'd been ignored for decades. I kept the rents reasonable, fixed what was broken, and treated people like human beings instead of numbers on a ledger. Word started to spread that I was different, that I actually cared if the heat worked and the roof didn't leak. By then, my mom's health was fading. She spent more time in bed than out of it, and every month I sent her half my income to cover her medications and groceries. I never told her how close I came to losing everything more than once. Sometimes I'd visit her in the little duplex where she still lived, and we'd sit on the porch in folding chairs, watching the neighborhood change around us. "They're going to try to push you out," she'd say. "They always do. Promise me you won't let them." I promised. A week after she passed, I stood in the doorway of my first duplex, the one I'd fixed up myself, and felt the weight of that promise settle on my shoulders like a mantle. It was grief and purpose all twisted together, and I knew I'd never be the same. The months that followed were a blur of renovations, late nights with spreadsheets, and tense meetings with investors who thought they were smarter than me. But every time someone tried to talk over me or dismiss me, I thought about my mom's tired hands counting tips at dawn. And I refused to back down. By the time I was 29, I owned nearly half the block, rundown buildings nobody else had cared to save. It wasn't glamorous, and I wasn't rich, not yet. But for the first time, I didn't feel like a trespasser in my own life. So when Mr. Reynolds showed up with that eviction notice, acting like he held all the power, he didn't realize I'd spent my whole life getting ready for that moment. The morning after Reynolds shoved that notice into my hand, I woke before dawn. For a few minutes, I just lay there in the dark, staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to the old pipes groan in the walls. All those years of work, every hour I'd put into these buildings, and he thought he could sweep it away with a single sheet of paper. But he didn't know everything. Not even close. I got up, dressed in my usual work jeans and boots, and walked the few blocks to my office. It wasn't much, just 2 rooms on the top floor of one of my older buildings, but it felt like mine. Sunlight was just starting to bleed through the blinds when I unlocked the file cabinet and pulled out the folder I'd kept hidden from everyone, even my closest friends. The folder was thick, dozens of contracts, deeds, and title records I'd spent years acquiring. As I flipped through them, I felt something steady rise in my chest. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every family who'd been pushed out of this neighborhood by men like Reynolds. I set the folder down and made a call to my attorney, a quiet woman named Jenna Clark who'd never once looked at me like I didn't belong in her office. "Tyler," she said when she picked up, her voice still husky with sleep. "Is everything okay?" "Yeah," I said. "Better than okay. I need you to meet me at the community hall at 10. Bring the file copies." She didn't ask questions. She never did. I hung up and went back to the cabinet, pulling out a small black notebook. My mother had given it to me on my 18th birthday. Inside, I'd written down every insult, every dismissal, every time someone had told me I wasn't meant for more. I flipped to the last page and wrote, "Today they find out." By 9:30, a small crowd had gathered in the community hall. Some were tenants from my buildings, families I'd helped over the years. Others were neighbors who'd come to gawk. And there, Standing near the folding chairs was Reynolds, flanked by his lawyer, a tall man in a pinstripe suit who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Reynolds spotted me and smirked. "This is a waste of time, Tyler. You can't stop progress." I walked past him without a word and took my place at the front of the room. My hands were steady as I opened the folder and laid out the documents across the table: ownership deeds, notarized statements, tax records. Proof. Jenna arrived right on time, her briefcase in hand. She gave me a small nod before she addressed the room. "For those who aren't aware," she began, "Mr. Tyler James is not merely a tenant in these properties. Over the past 4 years, he has legally acquired ownership of the majority of the structures on Oak Ridge Avenue, including the parcels Mr. Reynolds is attempting to redevelop." Reynolds let out a short, incredulous laugh. "That's ridiculous." Jenna didn't flinch. She pulled out a thick stack of copies and passed them down the rows of folding chairs. "These are the certified records. The deeds were filed properly with the county recorder's office. Any attempt to evict Mr. James is not only invalid, it's actionable." The room fell silent. Even the neighbors who'd never liked me shifted uncomfortably. I watched Reynolds' face turn red, then white. He snatched one of the papers and scanned it, his hand trembling. This is some kind of trick," he sputtered. "No," I said quietly, finally meeting his eyes. "It's not. You assumed I was too poor to matter, remember? That's what you told my mother when I was a kid. That people like us would be gone soon." I picked up a manila envelope and held it out to him. He hesitated before taking it. Inside was the final piece, an offer letter from a nonprofit community trust I'd been working with in secret. Together, we'd arranged financing to buy out any remaining properties Reynolds didn't own outright. The block would stay in local hands. No luxury condos. No forced evictions. "You don't own this neighborhood anymore," I told him. "And you never will." His lawyer started to speak, but Reynolds raised a hand, his jaw working like he was trying to swallow something bitter. "This isn't over," he finally said. "Actually," Jenna cut in, her voice as smooth as polished glass, "it is. You're welcome to contest the filings in court, but you'll lose. Everything is in order." Someone in the back of the room clapped, just one sharp, echoing clap. Then another joined in. Within seconds, the whole room erupted in applause. For the first time, I let myself smile. Not the polite, careful smile I'd worn my whole life, but something real. Reynolds shoved the envelope back into my hands and stalked out, his lawyer trailing behind him. As the door swung shut, I felt the knot that had been lodged in my chest since childhood finally loosen. Jenna leaned closer. "Congratulations," she murmured. "You did it." I nodded, too stunned to speak. After everyone left, I stayed behind to gather the papers. My hands were shaking now, not from fear but relief. I thought of my mother, how she'd sat on that porch with her coupons and whispered about the day we'd own something nobody could take. That day had come. I walked back to my office alone, the folder clutched tight to my chest. The summer sun was high overhead, casting long shadows across the sidewalks I used to mow for pocket change. I paused on the corner, watching as kids zipped by on bikes, their laughter ringing through the air. This was mine now, all of it. Not just the buildings, but the chance to make it better. To prove that no one could decide what I was worth. And in that moment, I knew I was finally free. The next morning, I woke to a dozen missed calls and 3 voicemails from Reynolds. I didn't bother listening to them. I already knew what they would say. Threats dressed up as negotiations, condescension wrapped in desperation. By the time I got to my office, there was a black SUV parked outside. 2 men in expensive suits were standing by the stoop, talking quietly. One of them noticed me and straightened, like he'd been waiting to pounce. "Mr. James," he called out, extending a hand I didn't take. "I'm David Harlow, legal counsel for Mr. Reynolds. Do you have a moment?" I pushed the office door open and gestured for them to follow. The air was stale from the heat, but I didn't turn on the fan. I wanted them to feel the discomfort. "We'd like to propose a more amicable solution," Harlow began, carefully laying out a folder on my desk. "There's no need for this to get messy. Mr. Reynolds is prepared to offer a buyout substantially above market value for all of your holdings. He paused, expecting me to lunge at the offer. When I didn't, he shifted uneasily. I took the folder, flipped it open, and scanned the first page. 7 figures. If I'd seen that number 5 years ago, it would have looked like salvation. But standing there now, with sweat sliding down the back of my neck and the sun glinting off the cracked linoleum, it felt like an insult. You think I've spent a decade building this up just to hand it over? I asked quietly. Harlow cleared his throat. I think you're making this personal when it's only business.
It is personal, I said.
It's always been personal. His colleague spoke up then, his tone dripping with manufactured concern. Tyler, may I call you Tyler? You have to understand, this is the only path forward. If you refuse, Mr. Reynolds will have no choice but to contest the filings and seek damages for obstruction. I smiled, though it didn't reach my eyes. You can call me Mr. James. And you can tell your boss to do whatever he thinks he needs to. Their faces twitched, just a flicker of irritation before they rearranged themselves back into corporate neutrality. They left the folder on my desk and retreated to their SUV, without another word. I waited until the vehicle pulled away before picking up my phone and dialing Jenna. They tried to buy me out, I told her.
Of course they did, she replied.
I'll draft a formal rejection. That afternoon, I walked the block. Every cracked sidewalk and faded porch felt different now, like it was finally breathing again. But the tension hadn't left. If anything, it had only sharpened. I could feel eyes on me from behind curtains, the curiosity and suspicion and resentment. When I reached Mrs. Carter's stoop, she was already waiting. She'd lived in the same apartment for 30 years, her rent never more than a third of her disability check. She'd watched me grow up and knew better than anyone how hard my mother had worked. You're stirring up a hornet's nest, baby, she said, her voice low. I know, I admitted. She patted my hand. Just remember, money changes people. Even good people. I won't forget. The next day, the letters started arriving. Cease and desist notices. Threats of litigation. Flyers slipped under doors warning tenants that their leases were in jeopardy. Reynolds was trying to turn the neighborhood against me the same way men like him always did, by sowing fear. One evening, I came home to find a group of tenants waiting by my porch steps. At the front was Lisa, a single mother who rented the second floor of one of my buildings. We need to talk, she said. Her voice was tight with worry. People are saying you're going to raise the rent or sell to some corporation. That we're all going to get evicted. I felt something twist in my chest. That was the weapon Reynolds had always counted on, the power of doubt. I'm not going to sell, I told them. And I'm not raising the rent. You have my word. Then why are there papers going around? She demanded. Because Reynolds knows he can't fight me in court, so he's trying to scare you, I said. I'm not the enemy. Lisa studied me, searching for any crack in my composure. Finally, she nodded. Okay, but you better not forget where you came from. I won't, I promised. After they left, I sat on the porch until long after the sun went down. The cicadas were buzzing, the air thick with the smell of honeysuckle. I thought of my mother again, how she'd taught me that dignity wasn't something anyone could give you, it was something you claimed for yourself. The next morning, I called a tenants' meeting. Dozens of people packed into the old rec center, their faces wary. I stood at the front and laid out everything, my ownership, Reynolds' offers, the threats. I can't stop him from trying to divide us, I said. But I can promise you that as long as I own these buildings, you will have a place here. Someone in the back raised a hand. How do we know you won't turn into him? It was a fair question. I'd asked myself the same thing 100 times. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my mother's black notebook, holding it up for everyone to see. I kept this since I was 18, I said. Every time someone told me I wasn't good enough. Every time someone tried to make me feel like I didn't matter. I'm not here to become another Reynolds. I'm here because no one should ever feel the way I felt growing up. The room was quiet. Slowly, heads began to nod. One by one, people came forward to sign a petition of support, a public record that they wanted me to keep ownership. That night, as I filed the papers, I thought of Lisa and her little boy, Mrs. Carter on her stoop, and all the other families who'd built lives on this block. They were more than tenants. They were the community my mother had believed in. But not everyone was willing to stand with me. 2 days later, I got a call from Mark Holloway, one of the smaller property owners I'd partnered with. His voice was thin with anxiety. "Tyler, I can't do this anymore," he said. "They offered me a buyout, triple what my buildings are worth. I've got medical bills. I can't say no." I closed my eyes. "I understand." "I'm sorry," he whispered. When the line went dead, I sat there for a long time, staring at the ledger on my desk. I couldn't save everyone, but I could hold my ground. Later that week, Reynolds made his last move. He called an emergency zoning board meeting, claiming I was in violation of several codes, fire safety, occupancy limits, a dozen other technicalities he'd paid inspectors to dig up. I walked into that meeting with Jenna at my side, and a stack of documentation thicker than my form. Reynolds was already there, leaning back in his chair like he owned the place. When I took my seat across from him, he smirked. "You can't win this," he said under his breath. I looked him in the eye, unblinking. "Watch me." The hearing lasted 4 hours. Every accusation he threw, we countered with evidence. Every time he tried to twist the truth, I corrected him, calmly and publicly. By the end, even the board members who'd been skeptical were shaking their heads in disgust. When the chairman finally ruled in my favor, the room erupted in murmurs. Reynolds' face went slack. He didn't look powerful anymore. He looked old, defeated. After the meeting, Lisa was waiting in the hall. She didn't say anything. She just hugged me. And for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. That night, I stood alone on the roof of my first building, watching the streetlights flicker to life. My mother's voice echoed in my mind. Patience might. She was right. I had waited my whole life for this. In the days after the zoning board hearing, something shifted in the neighborhood. The flyers stopped appearing under doors. The whispers quieted. And Reynolds, for the first time, seemed to vanish from sight. People started greeting me differently. Where once there had been suspicion and guarded politeness, now there was something approaching respect. Even so, I knew respect was fragile. It could vanish as fast as it arrived. If I wanted this block to thrive, it couldn't be built on fear of the next landlord. I spent the next week visiting every tenant personally. I sat in their kitchens and on their stoops, sipping burnt coffee and listening to their worries. I knew that no matter how many papers I signed or deeds I filed, none of it mattered if the people who lived here didn't believe in me. When I knocked on Lisa's door, she looked tired but less wary than before. Her little boy, Mason, peeked out from behind her leg. He'd grown taller in just the past year. I remembered the day she'd moved in, carrying him on her hip with his face buried in her neck. "Can I come in?" I asked. She stepped aside, and I followed her into the living room. The walls were decorated with bright crayon drawings and taped-up spelling tests. It smelled like cinnamon toast and something softer, the comforting scent of a place that was finally becoming home. "I wanted you to hear this from me," I began, sitting on the frayed couch. "Your lease isn't changing. The rent isn't going up. And if there's anything you need, repairs, improvements, I want to know." Lisa crossed her arms, studying me. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you were right," I said. "I can't forget where I came from. My mother raised me to believe that ownership means responsibility, not just to a building but to the people in it." Her face softened. For the first time since all this started, she smiled. "I believe you." Those words carried more weight than any victory in court. Over the next month, I worked with Jenna to formalize everything. We created a charter that guaranteed fair rent, transparent repairs, and community oversight. It wasn't flashy, but it was real, a foundation that couldn't be bought out by men like Reynolds. One afternoon, I sat with Mrs. Carter on her porch. She was peeling apples into a dented bowl, her gnarled hands moving with the same careful grace I remembered from when I was a boy. "You did good, Tyler," she said without looking up. "Your mama would be proud." I swallowed hard. I hope so. She would, she insisted, glancing over at me. And now you got a choice to make. You gonna spend your life fighting old ghosts, or you gonna build something better? Her question stayed with me long after I left. That evening, as the sun sank behind the rooftops, I made my decision. I couldn't live the rest of my days in the shadow of revenge. I needed something more. The next morning, I announced my plans. The community hall was packed, the air buzzing with curiosity. I stood at the front, hands clasped, and took a deep breath. I've spent a long time proving to certain people that I belong here. I began. And while I'm proud of what we've accomplished, it's not enough to keep fighting the same battles over and over. I paused, meeting as many eyes as I could. So, I'm putting the future of this block in all our hands. I'm creating a community trust. Every tenant will have a voice in how these properties are managed. No more surprise evictions, no more backroom deals. We're going to prove that people like us can own something and take care of it. There was a moment of stunned silence before someone started clapping. Then another. Soon the entire room was on their feet, the noise washing over me like a wave. After the meeting, Lisa came up, her eyes bright with something I hadn't seen before, hope. You really mean it? She asked. I do, I said. She nodded, pressing Mason closer to her side. Then maybe this place can finally feel like home. I spent the next few weeks working with lawyers and financial advisors to make it official. The paperwork was endless, but every signature felt like another brick in something that would outlast me. One evening, as I sorted through lease agreements, Jenna stopped by. She leaned against the doorway, arms folded. You know, she said, most people in your position would have taken that buyout and disappeared. I know, but you didn't. I looked up at her. Neither did you. She smiled. Fair enough. There was a knock at the door, and Mark Holloway stepped in, hat in hand. His face was pale, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. Tyler, he began, voice cracking. I was wrong. About everything. I didn't say anything, just waited. I took their money, he confessed. But I didn't feel right. I want to help if you'll let me. For a moment, the old anger flared up. But then I thought about what Mrs. Carter had asked me, if I was going to spend my life fighting ghosts. You can help, I said finally. But you're going to have to earn everyone's trust back. I know, he whispered. A week later, he was back in the meetings, drafting plans and apologizing to tenants. It didn't fix everything, but it was a start. As the summer turned to fall, the block began to change. Fences were repaired, porches painted, sidewalks repaved. Kids played without worrying about moving trucks or eviction notices. One morning, I stood in the doorway of my first building, the same place I'd signed my first deed, and watched the sunrise spill over the rooftops. It struck me that this was the closest I'd ever come to peace. I thought of my mother, how she'd held on to hope even when everything seemed impossible. And I knew I'd kept my promise. 3 months later, the block didn't look the same. The change wasn't flashy, but it was steady and unmistakable. Fresh paint glowed on porches that had been chipped for decades. The sidewalks were no longer cracked and uneven but smooth and welcoming. At night, the new streetlights cast a golden glow over the front steps, where neighbors gathered to talk instead of hiding behind locked doors. Some evenings, I walked the whole block end to end, just to see it with my own eyes. Part of me still didn't believe it was real. Every time I passed Mrs. Carter's stoop, she'd call out a greeting and lift her apple-peeling knife in a silent salute. She liked to say we were both too stubborn to give up, and maybe she was right. On a crisp October morning, we held a small ceremony to mark the official launch of the Community Trust. It was simple, just a gathering of residents and supporters on the lawn in front of the rec center. A folding table held stacks of documents waiting for signatures. Mason ran circles around Lisa's legs while she tried to pin him down long enough to keep his shirt tucked in. Jenna stood beside me, holding a clipboard, her face uncharacteristically soft. You did it, she murmured, almost to herself. No, I said. We did. When it was my turn to speak, I stepped up to the makeshift podium. I looked over the crowd, faces I'd known my whole life, and some I'd only just started to understand. My mother used to tell me that ownership is about more than deeds and papers. I began. She said it was about taking care of something, believing in it even when nobody else does. For a long time, I thought I was proving something to people who didn't care. But standing here today, I realize I wasn't proving it to them. I was proving it to all of you and to myself. The wind picked up, rustling the papers on the table. I felt the familiar tightness in my chest, but this time it wasn't fear. It was gratitude. I won't pretend this will always be easy. I continued. There will be challenges, disagreements, and setbacks. But this is ours now. Not mine, ours. And nobody can take it away. The applause came slowly at first, then built into something that seemed to lift the whole yard. I stepped back, blinking fast against the sting in my eyes. One by one, tenants came forward to sign the charter, their names scrawled next to mine. Each signature felt like a nail driven into something solid and lasting. When Lisa stepped up, Mason clutching her hand, she looked me in the eye and smiled. "This is the first time I've felt safe in a long time," she said. I nodded, unable to speak. Safe. That was the word I'd never dared to hope for. After the signing, we shared a potluck meal on folding tables. Mrs. Carter brought her famous sweet potato pie, and someone set up a battered radio playing old Motown songs. As the sun dipped behind the buildings, kids chased each other across the lawn while their parents laughed and talked. I sat on the steps, a paper plate balanced on my knee, and tried to take it all in. The neighborhood wasn't perfect. Nothing ever would be. But for the first time, it wasn't about survival. It was about belonging. Later that night, after everyone had drifted home, I locked up the rec center and walked back to my office. The air smelled like cooling asphalt and the faint sweetness of fallen leaves. I paused on the corner where I'd stood as a kid, clutching a sack of groceries while Mr. Gallagher told my mother we didn't belong. I thought about going back there, finding him wherever he was, and telling him he'd been wrong. But I realized I didn't need to.
The proof was all around me.
Back in my office, I took down the black notebook from the shelf. I flipped to the last page, where I'd written, "Today they find out." Underneath it, I added a final line in careful letters. "Tomorrow, we begin." I closed the notebook and placed it in a box with my mother's old apron and the deed to my first duplex. One day, I'd pass them on to someone else. Maybe Mason, when he was old enough. Or maybe some other kid who'd been told he didn't matter. A week later, Lisa knocked on my door. She was nervous, shifting from foot to foot. "Tyler," she began, "I was thinking I've been working in accounting for 10 years. If you need help managing the trust, I'd like to volunteer." I smiled, surprised and relieved. I'd be honored. That afternoon, she brought her laptop and a stack of color-coded folders. We worked late into the evening, going over budgets and plans for improvements. When she finally left, I realized I hadn't thought about Reynolds in days. It was over. He'd moved on to some other neighborhood, some other target, but this block was out of his reach. 3 months later, in early January, we hosted a ribbon-cutting ceremony for the renovated playground. A local reporter came to take photos, and for once I didn't shy away from the camera. When the article ran in the paper, the headline read, "Local man revives community he was once told to leave." I clipped it out and pinned it to the bulletin board in my office. Not because I needed the recognition, but because it felt like the final page of a story that had started long before I was born. That night, I walked the block one last time before going home. Lights glowed warmly in every window. Somewhere, someone was playing Sam Cooke, the melody drifting into the cold air. I stopped at the corner where my mother used to wait for the bus after her cleaning shifts. I closed my eyes and pictured her standing there, tired but proud. "I did it, Mama," I whispered. The wind lifted my words and carried them down the street. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged.